So happy Saturday to you. I'm out again. It's middle of November. Thought I'd come out for two reasons. Firstly, it's a really lovely mild day and night forecast, although it has got a little misty out there and I managed to miss a sunset, but mainly because I have a new tent. This is the Tarptent double rainbow double wall. So the standard double rainbow is a single skin tent. This is a double wall tent, so much more appropriate for British weather where you suffer with lots of condensation. The tent comes with a 7mm Eastern 3.9 carbon pole, which is 3.7 metres long. It only weighs 125 grams, and that's basically the support that runs up the seam in the middle of the double rainbow. I guess they call it a rainbow because it forms an arc like a rainbow. Positively, the pole is exactly the same as is used on the cross poles of the SCART 1. They're 3.7 metre by 8.6mm aluminium poles, but they're the same length and they are interchangeable. So I could use the SCART 1's cross poles as the arch pole in this if I ever have an accident with the carbon version. The benefit of using the carbon pole is it's 80% lighter than the much more weighty aluminium version. Coming on to the weight, that's one of the amazing things about this tent. It's 1.148 kilograms all in. That's the stuff sack, the inner, the outer, the 6 pegs that come with it, which are Eastern Nano 6-inch blue pegs, and the very short guy lines that come with it, and the pole, the arch pole, and a very short cross brace at the top, which acts as a spreader at the top of the tent. All in 1.148 kilograms. Now that isn't actually very much more than the Lanshan 2 Pro without the walking poles. That comes in, if you include the stuff sack, the pegs and the tent, that has no inner, single skin tent as well, that comes in at 1044 grams. So this is only 100 grams heavier and it's a standalone tent. You don't need your walking poles as well for it. The tent is made of a 30 denier sil nylon outer for the fly with a 5000mm hydrostatic head, and interestingly the floor is again a 30 denier sil nylon, but it only has a 3000mm static head. That to me is a little bit of a worry because in the UK the ground's usually fairly soggy, and when you kneel on low hydrostatic head materials you can end up getting wetness through into the tent. So I'm actually using this at the moment with a Cloud Peak 2 ground sheet, as that fits quite nicely underneath it and it should protect the base of the tent. So it's a double rainbow, which is ostensibly for 2 people. It's 127 centimeters wide at the base and 224 centimeters long. So in terms of the floor area, it actually trumps both the Lanshan 2 Pro and the Cloud Peak 2, but inside it does taper up. The beauty of the Lanshan 2 Pro is that you have the ridge across the top, which is full height all the way across, but you have a huge high area inside. So whilst the floor area of this tent trumps both of those other 2 tents, it doesn't feel quite as big in here as the Lanshan 2 Pro. And I think it's because the headroom is only 18 inches wide, whereas with the 2 Pro it's the entire width of the tent. In terms of the height, it's on a par with virtually every other tent of this type. 101 centimeters at the apex, so it means I'm about 6'1". I can sit up quite comfortably in here with at least a few inches of headroom above me when I'm sitting on my sleeping mat. So no real complaints with the headroom. And I do find that the corners of the inner do sag inwards quite a lot. So whilst this is plenty big enough, it's a voluminous tent for 1 person, I think if you had 2 people in here, you'd find that your head in the corners would touch the edge of the fly. And it's a shame there isn't any other fixing points between the inner and the outer, just to pull these corners out that little bit more towards the fly, which would make it feel a lot more voluminous inside here. Interestingly, the tent comes with no guy lines as standard. You've got 4 corner pegs and they're attached to both the fly and the inner by webbing and buckles, which is a really pleasant way to cinch up a tent, and so much better than the Lanshan 2 Pro's terrible little cord locks. So this works really well, just 4 pegs at the 4 corners with no guy lines, and then each of the 2 vestibule doors has just a short loop on it which you also peg out. That's tightened with a cord lock. Obviously with the single arch pole it does lend itself to lateral movement. So on the arch pole there are 2 webbing loops approximately halfway down each of the sides, and I've made myself 4 supplemental guy lines which I can clip on and off of those, which will give me some hope that it will perform quite admirably in windy conditions with that extra supplemental arch support on there. The tent has some really interesting features available to it. One of them is that on the huge vestibules that are on both sides of this tent, and they really are enormous, as you open the vestibule, much like on a Lanshan 2 Pro, you can open one or both sides of the vestibule. The rest of the tent will remain perfectly intact when you do this. So you can open up one entire side or even both entire sides of your tent. But of course that does leave you prone to any rainy weather. So between the 2 fly doors there is a velcroed gusset, and if you open both of the doors and then attach the gusset onto the second door, if you've got walking poles with you, you can then peg up the 2 doors in an open position, so there's an almost horizontal open porch, which gives you a huge amount of weather protection whilst also giving you an enormous porch area that you could actually sit out under even if it's raining and keep yourself dry. That's a really interesting feature and something that I've only ever seen with the double rainbow series of tents. Another, what I think is unique selling point, maybe it isn't, the tent can be pitched in an inner only fashion, and then it only weighs about 700 grams. I think it's 672 grams inner only. You can pitch inner first and then attach the fly, or you can pitch inner and fly together with them attached together. Unfortunately, because the arch sleeve is on the inner of the tent, you can't only pitch the outer. But how often would you actually want to do that? You might as well buy a tarp in that case. But the really interesting feature of this tent is the ventilation options. That with the tent erected, you can unclip the fly and roll it up so that there's a clip approximately halfway up the arch pole and another one at the apex, and you can roll the fly and clip it halfway up to give you a lot of ventilation, or all the way up to the apex to give you one end of the tent with no fly outside it, and it's called stargazing mode. And what a fabulous thing to do in the middle of summer, to lay in your tent looking out with no fly on the outside, but have the protection from the wind and the elements at the other end of the tent. Or if it's really going to be good weather, you can take the fly completely off. But I think that is a really clever option. Whether I use it or not is another matter, but it's really nice to have that option. The tent is really quite quick to pitch. Being that there's only the single arch pole and a little cross pole on it, and only 6 pegs, it's probably the quickest tent I've got to pitch, which was quite useful this evening, as I turned up here quite a bit later than I would have liked, just after sunset in fact, and it meant that I could pitch the tent very, very quickly, even though it's only the second time I've pitched it. Pitched it once to seam seal it. That seam sealing took me about an hour to do, and then I pitched it out here this evening. The Lanshan 2 Pro, I really love that tent, but is it a ball ache to pitch, or to pitch properly? You get it up and then you spend the rest of the evening adjusting the tension of everything. This double rainbow, put it up first time, once it got damp, cinched up some of the buckles, and that's all I've done to it. It's a really fast pitch tent, which I really appreciate. Obviously this tent, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have a UK or European reseller, so I had to import it directly from Tarptent in the United States. It came all the way across from the Pacific Northwest to Stansted Airport in, I think, 4 days. It didn't actually get to me until 12 days had elapsed though, but that was partly because UPS managed to misplace my tent. I had 4 separate "we've delivered" notifications from them, but no tent had arrived. And then finally, on day 12, it arrived without any notification that it was either coming or that it had got to me. So it did get here eventually. Import duty wise, I was only stung 8.6%, and that included the VAT, the duty and the UPS fees. So I think 8.6%, I'm more than happy with that. Should be at least a quarter, possibly as high as a third of the value of the tent. I definitely don't think that the double rainbow is as pretty or as handsome as some of the other tents I've got. I really think the Lanshan 2 Pro is a pretty tent. All of its proportions work really, really well, and when it's pitched well, I think it is a beautiful looking tent. Scarp 1 I think is a handsome tent. It's brutal, it's rugged, and it gives you the feeling that it's going to protect you. Double rainbow, it's a bit of an odd look to me. It's a little bit bulbous, it's got some little bumps and lumps to it. Definitely wouldn't call it a pretty tent, but space wise inside, the inside is large, the vestibules are enormous, so I suppose it's horses for courses here. Does it matter what your tent looks like? Yes, it does. Although I've only put this tent up twice, and this is my first time actually in it, there are a few things I think perhaps could be done a little bit better. First one is, it's very difficult to keep the seam aligned with the arch pole over the top. The seam is actually quite rigid, but of course sil nylon has a degree of elasticity to it. So what you find is, rather than the rigid seam sitting on top of the arch pole, it slips to one side. So across the tent, you'll find that the seam is one side, then the other across the tent. Is it a problem? No, it isn't. Is it a visual irritation? Yes, it is. There are fixing points at 3 points for the fly onto the arch pole, but they don't really help very much. They still allow a little bit of lateral movement, so a little bit of an irritation there. Second thing that could be improved is the pockets for the walking poles on the ends of the tent when you're converting it into standalone. The pockets are frugally designed. They're quite small and neither fit very well over the ends of my Black Diamond Trail Pro walking poles. They're very, very snug fit. Another thing that irks me is the fly outer door zippers. They're only one-way zippers. They're not the typical two-way zippers. That means that the apex vents on either side, which should ventilate you quite well, you can't zip down the outer doors a little bit to give you greater apex ventilation. You can do that on the Scarp 1, and I use it virtually all of the time. You can't do it on these. It also means that you can't zip down the outer to have a look out and see what the weather's doing outside. You've got to unzip the whole door from the bottom to see what's going on. Now, I mentioned that the outer fly connects to the arch pole at 3 points, halfway up each side and at the apex. Now, the fixing points are cord locks on webbing straps, and you poke the cord lock through a webbing loop which goes over the top of the arch pole. The only thing is that those webbing loops are very, very, very snug, and trying to get the cord locks through them when the tent is erect is nigh on impossible. You can do it, I've done it, but it is very, very difficult. So if you want to roll the fly up when you've already put the tent up, it's very difficult to try and get those cord locks through those tight loops. Another interesting feature of this tent is that you can actually set it up in freestanding mode if you've got some walking poles with you. So long as your walking poles will extend to 140, maybe a little bit more centimetres, which my Trail Pros do, you extend them and then you clip them into the corner of each end, and then there's a clip that goes in the middle, and it converts the tent to semi-freestanding. The vestibules are still loose and flappy, but the main floor and body of the tent is freestanding. So you can pick the tent up and move it elsewhere, or if you want to pitch it at home or in the office as I do in order to seam seal it, then you can stick the poles in, and it's a nice easy way to pitch the tent, to dry it, seam seal it or whatever. Quite a clever idea, that. Another interesting feature are the panels at the end. The inner of the tent has solid all the way around the base of it to help with keeping the wind out. But if you want ventilation or to allow you to see out, these end panels have Velcro on them. You can just unclip them and pull them down, and then you have a mesh panel. And if you have the fly rolled up, then you can see outside through those panels. And I can feel at the moment there's actually quite a reasonable bit of ventilation coming through there. So what have I done already to make the tent work that little bit better for me? Well, as I've already mentioned, I added 4 guy lines which I can attach to the arch pole. The weather this evening is not forecast to be breezy at all, so I've not fitted those. But I have got the option in my bag to add those 4 extra guy out points. I've also seam sealed the tent. Came from Tarptent unseam sealed, so I used approximately 50ml of a mineral spirit and silicone mix and painted it on to the arch seam, the cross seam, and then the seams down to each of the corners. Oh, and down either side of the waterproof YKK zippers on each of the fly doors. So all of that sealed. I did the seam sealing on the SCART one myself as well. That worked very well, so I'm hopeful it will work equally well on this. You can get Tarptent to seam seal it, but I do prefer to do it myself because I know very precisely how it's been done, and then I'm comfortable that it's going to work for me. Another thing I've done, which is a big irritation for me, it's the same thing on the SCART one. Whilst the fly doors have a cord lock and a loop to allow you to roll them up and then easily clip them open, for some reason the inner doors just come with 2 fly-away bungee cord ends. And even on the Tarptent official setup video for how to pitch this tent, when the guy comes to tie up the inner doors, the video cuts and you don't see him how he does it, and I'm never really too sure how you do it. You just do a basic knot and they fall open. You do a reef knot or something in them and then you can't undo them again. So I'm not quite sure what sort of thing you should do. Maybe you have to do a bow, I don't know. But the same as on the SCART one, what I've done is I've sewn one of the loose ends into a loop, and then I've put a cord lock on the other one. So it works in identical fashion to the outside door, which works really well. You just pull the cord lock through the loop, cinch it up, and the inner door is then tied back. To open it, you just open the loop up a little bit, the cord lock pings out, and the door shuts. Works really well. They've done it on the outer doors, not too sure why they don't do it on the inner doors. The last thing I've already done to it is I've put little tiny shock cord loops on the YKK's inner zippers. 2 reasons I do that. One of them is they're easier to grab in the dark, and the other reason is they stop the clink of the metal zipper pull against each other when it's slightly breezy. So I've done that on the inners, on both of them, and on the outer doors. So, good morning. First coffee of the day. Had a relatively restful night. Fortunately, I remembered to partially deflate my sleeping mat before going to sleep, which stops my hips and shoulders from getting numb overnight, which is good. The tent performed admirably well. It's been a really wet night, not with rain, but the fog rolled in about 8 o'clock, and it was a really thick pea super, and everything is absolutely sodden just because of the fog. I've woken up this morning, it's equally foggy again this morning, so the tent outside is pretty wet. The inside has got condensation on it, but considering there was virtually no breeze at all and how wet it was, it's not as bad as I thought it might be, and I'm lovely and dry in here because of the double skin. Talking of the double skin though, it's something that I've noticed that perhaps I'm going to have to make another modification. I'll just bring you inside and show you this. Put my coffee out there. Now, this is the inside of the tent, and you've got the fly on the outside, and the inner is connected here, here and here, and at the four corners. So when you pull the fly taut, there's potentially about an 8-inch gap between the fly and the side walls of the tent around here. So what I did last night was, just to see if it was going to work, I used this side's door tie back, and I've connected, I don't know whether you can see it there, the inner door tie back to the outer door tie back, and it's pulled the inner and the outer towards each other, so there's only about 50 millimeters, 2 inches of clearance there. If you look down this end where I haven't got the tie backs, I've got one of them in there, I don't know whether you can see there, there's about another 8 to 10 inches, 200 millimeters of gap between the inner and the outer. There's plenty there, and it gives you a much wider inner at the base and at shoulder height. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew some loops onto the inner on this seam here and connect them to the tie back for the outer door. Still be able to use the tie back from the outer door, but this will be another point at which the two parts of the tent are connected together, and it gives you a significant extra width at shoulder height and at the base of the tent, and I think it'll work really well. So I'll give it a go, and the next time I'm out in it, I'll do a quick video to tell you how well it works, or if it doesn't work, of course. As it is quite damp this morning, and I wanted to air the tent out before I pack it all away as best I can, I've actually converted the outside of the tent to porch mode. I'll video that when I actually get outside, but from in here, hopefully you can see that I've got the two fly doors pegged out on the walking poles, and then in the middle there's this gusset panel here which joins together one door and the other door, and it gives you a quite vast enclosed porch area, which is great in this sort of weather because it gives me protection from the wind. The only downside of it that I've noticed so far is that the gusset panel velcros on at the end, and there is actually a gap here, so if it's actually raining you're going to get rained on. I mean, most of the rain should, if even it hits this crest, run down this way or run down that way, because this is the high point. But a little bit more velcro along there would only have been a few more grams, and I think it would have reaped dividends. But it is a clever feature and does give you this vast porch area in which to keep all your gear dry and move about in. So big thumbs up for that one from Tarptent. So here's my pitch, and you can see this side of the tent is set up in porch mode at the moment, using the two walking poles. to give you that vast porch area. I rigged the guy line with these little tiny clips that I got off of Amazon so that they can clip onto or off of the webbing tie-out points. And because the guys clip on and off quite easily, that means that if I wanted to, I could clip them onto the webbing loop on the arch pole and have the guy line coming out to be supplemental support for the arch as well, using the same guy lines in 2 different applications. At each of the 4 corners, pegged out with the Eastern Nano 6-inch stakes, and you can see the webbing with the cam locks on there, and you tighten it just by pulling. Same sort of thing with a webbing loop and a cam lock on the inside as well. And it's the same on the arch pole. This one's loosened at the moment to allow the fly to rise up a little bit for ventilation purposes, but you can just pull it to bring it back down. On the doors there's these very short guy lines, again with tension adjusters on there. So here the right side of the tent is in its normal configuration with the doors staked to the ground, and the left side of the tent over there is in its porch configuration with the doors pulled out and the gusset panel in place to give you a covered porch area.